All right, today we are talking about the segregated South and women. So we're going to look at kind of what develops after Reconstruction fails, and then how segregation ends up coming to dominate the South for really till the 1960s, and even then after that there's still remnants of it that last, you could argue even to this day. Some more specific ones, there was still stuff hanging around in the 80s, but there's still remnants of that, even if it's not official, that still exist. So first, when looking at what was going on, we have the changes that take place because of what's called the New South, as this white Southerners were calling it, and the Redeemers. So the Redeemers were the ones that had taken over at the end of the Reconstruction period, and they were the ones that had pushed back on like all of the policies that the federal government was trying to create, as well as kind of all of the policies that they were trying to enact with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. So the first thing with this, and I mentioned this at the last one, but I'm going to put it on here too, right? They claimed, what they claimed was that they had saved the South and restored it to its original glory. And this certainly, that original glory was something that then is going to be used as kind of an excuse to try to reframe the South into this I don't know, like looking back at the original glory of the South, but trying to cut out the idea of slavery within it. A good example of that would be like Gone with the Wind, which was written later, but tried to romanticize the South. That's a good word for it. It's also that kind of new argument that still exists today as well, of reframing the Civil War as solely a states' rights issue, and not having to do with slavery, but also a romanticization of it as well. So that's where you have idolizing the Confederate soldiers, the charm of the Old South, things like that. But it's definitely this kind of two-part of we saved and restored. I don't know why it's doing the pressure thing today. And restored. Those are kind of the key aspects of it, of this idea, of what the Redeemers were arguing. So let me fix that. Restored to the original glory. Okay, so the next part, of course, was that part of that original glory was white control, which they also are going to reinstitute, and specifically within this limiting Black power and agency. And we're going to look at how the segregated South does that in various ways. So that this is kind of like all the things that their goals, and what they accomplished. Next was this idea of being independent from the industrialized North, right? So the North was still kind of cast as this evil entity, and specifically industrialization, right? It was because of industrialization that's what set the South apart. And they'd use this argument in prior to the Civil War in trying to defend the South and slavery, and claim that was better than anything the North created. In fact, the North was creating white slavery, or wage slavery was the other term used with industrialization. And then looking to undo, which they'd already done some with Reconstruction, but they're going to continue to do this process through this early part of the segregated South, is undo as much of Reconstruction policies as possible. Okay, so anything that they could, now that they were firmly in charge of the government again, trying to actively remove as much as possible. So they cut public spending. The thing with these choices that they did is that it ultimately hurt poor white Southerners as well. But I think that can be shown in, like, when we looked at the plantation mistress, the plantation elite and stuff, that they didn't care. Because this really was the wealthy still controlling this. And while ideally they put in benefits where they could for the poor white population in the South, if they had to hurt them in order to prevent any type of black power and agency, then that was fine. They were willing to do that. They cut state taxes and budget, which also would help with infrastructure and education and all of that. And then reduced public facilities. So this went hand in hand with the state budget. And so with this was specifically schools for the black population that had been arising during Reconstruction, specifically cutting funding to those as much as they could. They cut funding from health care, again, because the wealthy can afford to pay for it. This is hospitals, jails, asylums, any of that stuff. And then they cut all funding to, well, yeah, I'll leave that in there because the other says reduce. But they actually cut funding to Freedmen's Bureau. So the Freedmen's Bureau was created right after the war, and it was meant to protect black interests, looking at helping in land, Freedmen's Bureau, land, education, jobs, making sure that their rights were protected, and all of that type of stuff. And so this was specifically targeted to, of course, cut out and remove and send home any Northerner that was part of the Freedmen's Bureau, so that they could not help anyone navigate any of this stuff, or I don't know, find other options. It was all just a targeted attack. And they still had informal employment requirements. Now, they couldn't have the same one that the black codes had, because that had been deemed unconstitutional. But there were still informal rules that they followed, which allowed them to then increase arrests, which of course targeted black men mostly, but women were occasionally arrested for this. Although this, like I said, was largely more of a target towards black men. And this was specifically the purpose was to send them to jails on what they created called the chain gangs. And this was hard labor and free labor. Some of it was completely pointless. Other times they had them doing farming and things like that. But they made money off of they made money off of the chain gangs. It was also meant to be a deterrent for anyone who thought that they could question or challenge this new system. And done so by, it had very bad conditions. And besides being extremely hard, we'll put back here too, the harsh labor, you had high death rates. And there was actually, within those death rates, a lot of times it was from dehydration, because there was a lack of food and water, or exhaustion. Both dehydration and exhaustion took place. And right, the purpose of this was to remind the Black population in the South who was in charge, and not to challenge that, right? That was kind of a key aspect, and we'll see that with lynching as well, that it was about creating a sense of fear in a variety of ways in order to maintain control and power, and then to make money, as we saw, right? And then it allows for the farming and stuff that way. The next thing that took place was a decline that they did. Let's see, where we're on EF. And a direct and immediate attempt in a decline in Black politics and disenfranchisement. Right, so you had, to give you an idea of the numbers, you had in 1894 130,000 registered Black male voters, right? Of course, because it was only men at this point. It will eventually, this why we're talking about what they're going to do with the voting is because while initially it doesn't impact women, simply because the 14th and 15th Amendment excluded women, that will change, and yet women will still be subjected to these same limitations. So while, of course, right, in this early period, women couldn't vote anyway, any women, when women do get the right to vote, Black women are still going to be faced with these issues. By 1904, you had 1,342 registered Black voters. So, I mean, it was clearly super effective in doing exactly what they wanted, and completely eliminating the ability for most Black men initially, and then women, to be able to vote. They also were looking, we're going to talk more about that in just a second, but I wanted to put those numbers out there so you could just see how a drastic of a change it was in just the sheer number of registered voters. Then, of course, remove Black leaders from politics, because there had been a push and increase in Black political leaders. And of course, that the way to do that was taking away the vote. And by taking away the vote, then only the wealthy white people and some poor white Southerns will see this disenfranchises some of them too. But if you take away the ability to vote, then they're not going to get reelected into office, and then you control pretty much everything in that process. So the first thing that they did within enacting this was to create a poll tax. Okay, now a poll tax, this actually sticks around for a while. This was a fee that all citizens had to pay if they wanted to vote. And it was for everyone. It didn't matter who. The thing is that the fee was intentionally largely too expensive for the average Black voter. It was also too expensive and the poor white voter, right? as I said, we see again and again, they just were like, well, whatever. We can disenfranchise them too because it doesn't really matter. However, they are going to attempt to add something into this list to try to get some of the poor white Southerners back, but it's going to be also deemed unconstitutional, and so they'll have to remove it. So then they created the grandfather clause. That's this. So because they did not want to completely, as much as they were okay with eliminating poor white Southerners and really access to things and right to vote, they still did initially try to have a workaround. And this basically said if your grandfather could vote, then you can too. Right? So if you can't pay the poll tax, but your grandfather was able to vote, then you don't have to pay the poll tax. Which, of course, then it got them around that, and the literacy test, which was the other part of it. So this eventually found unconstitutional. So this won't stay long. Right, so then once this goes, then of course, if we kind of remove that one from the equation, you have the poll tax still. So how do you then, okay, that takes it out of, okay, some people are not going to have enough money to vote, but there will be people who can raise the funds to do this. So how do we further attempt to eliminate that? Well, remember the new departure said that what the Supreme Court decided was that voting was a privilege, not a right. And it should be given to those that are basically deemed worthy of it. So the literacy test is created essentially under that premise of that they're just making sure that they have educated voters. And this is directly when I mentioned that this impacted more than just women in general. This is where you see it, is the new departure Supreme Court case allowed this to happen. Okay, so that was the purpose. Again, it still was, you still had a problem, right? Because a large portion of the South was illiterate or near illiterate or near to it. And this included the poor white Southerners, and this, of course, didn't help because they had cut funding to public schools. So the South was not good at public education. It was never their priority because ultimately the wealthy didn't care. And so this intentionally was meant to set up to be hard to weed out people. Now, they didn't want to just completely eliminate the white vote. This still did, because you were going to have some that no matter what was given to them, they weren't going to be able to read it. But so what they did is that they structured it so if you were a white versus black voter, you had different questions. And we're going to look at that in just a second. And then they also added in a specific questions section. So there was the reading section. So I already have different questions, I guess different readings here. So if you somehow passed the reading part, you had these other questions section that you could then potentially eliminate someone as well. So let's look at that and see what it did. Because again, now while women, as I mentioned, were not initially part of this, they get the right to vote. This is still active in the South. So this did end up applying to women as well. And in fact, some of the women who were most prevalent, Ida B. Wells, for example, eventually do pass the test. But it took even her, she was highly educated, multiple tries. So it just shows how unfair it was that you had a highly educated woman who still had to go in and take it multiple times to be able to pass, to be able to vote, which is how skewed this thing was. I'm going to put it up so we can look at it. So I'm going to pause it just a second and then that will pop up. All right, so the first part, and I know this is still a little small, so I apologize for that. The next one down here is a little bit bigger, but I'm going to read through it. And you do have this document under the primary sources, so you can look at a larger version there. So you have two parts. The questions that was like the application, right? This is the Mississippi voter registration application form, and then you have the readings that you had to do. So let's look at the question section first, and then we'll look at the readings, because some of the questions deal with the reading itself. Okay, so the date, name, etc. Right? It does ask, by whom are you employed? So let's put here. Put D. Oops. And many states adopted this voting questionnaire. Okay, so the first one, right, is employment. And that in itself could be used, even though it doesn't specifically say, it's saying if not employed, so state, and this can be used against you. We're going to kind of put the different, this list here is going to be the things that could be used against you. Now, women would have a little more leeway with employment, because if you said, if you're not employed because I'm a mother, or a housewife, that would be acceptable. For men, it would be more of a detriment against them. But for women, it kind of had to fit into that traditional domestic sphere reason of why you weren't employed. So for employment, that one wasn't as detrimental towards women, but that one was used as in general against people, more for men though. And then it's, what is your place of residence? Which of course is just, are you a citizen of Mississippi? How long have you resided in Mississippi? Stop clicking on all that. Okay. State your last previous places of residence. Why this would be potentially difficult is if you moved around a lot for jobs. Black people in the South didn't always have stable locations to live. And so that could be used against you if you can't list all your previous residences. And then, are you a minister? The only reason for that question is there's like a separate oath for ministers. Here's the minister's oath, or minister wife's oath. So that one isn't going to get used against you. It's just because it went to that separate oath. Okay, then it says, is there more one person? No, the same name. No. Have you ever been convicted of any of the following crimes? Bribery, theft, arson, obtaining money or goods under false pretenses, perjury, forgery, embezzlement, or bigamy. So then you have it asking for convicted of crimes. And then it goes into, have you ever been convicted of any other crime except misdemeanor for traffic? So traffic didn't count later on when there's cars, but all other crimes did. So why would this be potentially problematic? Well, the black codes were not, oops, sorry, dropped my pen. We're not that far removed, where pretty much everything, circling with the word crimes here, where pretty much everything could be a crime if they wanted it to be. And then even under the segregated South, which goes, like I said, through the 1960s legally in the law, there you could get charged with a crime for using a white drinking fountain or being in a white area. So there was just an abundance of ways that black people were charged with crimes in in render Reconstruction with the black codes, and then in the segregated South. And this can be used to eliminate someone from being able to vote. And then explain, yes, right? Now, 18 and 19 and 20, well, we'll look at 20 in a minute, 18 and 19. Write and copy in the space below the section that they give you of the Constitution of Mississippi, and then write in the space below a reasonable interpretation. Notice they don't give you a lot of space to do this, and we'll see how much they have to do that in just a minute. So then you have to write. So you have to be able to write well, because you have to be able to write and copy the selection from the Constitution, from the state Constitution. Now, this is also why this did eliminate any white voter that was not literate enough to do this. And it did. And again, that's why they had the grandfather clause in initially. When that fails, they have to do this, because segregated South is eventually going to have, and we'll talk about this, separate but equal, which it never was. It was never equal, but you had to at least pretend. And so the registration application and form was pretending. Oh, we give this to all voters, all people who want to register to vote. Yes, but as we're going to see, these questions are set to be able to eliminate black voters more easily, and the readings that they have them do even more so. So the questions, yes, but we'll look at the reading in just a second. It's far more obvious that it's an attempt to do that. But the poor white Southerners that were illiterate or barely literate were not going to be able to do this, even with on easy level, if you will. Even on the easiest setting that they could possibly give to a white voter, if they were not literate enough to write this stuff out and then understand it well enough to say what the meaning is, they weren't going to pass. However, it still allowed some poor white Southerners to pass because it is easy. So you had that kind of in-between level of those who could at least muster out the kind of basic minimum literacy, and then those that were really not that literate that weren't going to probably be able to do this. But the second part then is write a reasonable interpretation. So not only did you have to write and copy the reading, you had to also be able to explain in your own words what it meant. We're going to look at those in just a second. Let's finish with the questions, and then we'll look at those specifically. So number 20, write in the space below a statement setting forth your understanding of the duties and obligations of citizenship. So write understanding of duties of citizenship. So why might this be used against someone? Well, it's somewhat subjective how you a polling official decides if you've done that successfully. So they could allow a Southerner, a white Southerner, to have kind of created a bare minimum description of what the duty of a citizen is. And then yet when a black woman comes up and is trying to vote and she writes out an explanation, they can look at that, oh, that's not good enough. It needs to be more detailed. So the problem is right, that some of these questions, even we'll see writing out a reasonable interpretation. The copy one's pretty straightforward. You either copied it or you didn't. But the reasonable interpretation is also subjective. So my numbers, number 5 and 6, right? The problem is that these are subjective. And then it says you sign it, right, and say your oath. And then underneath here, this is for the polling officials, okay? So they fill this out after you've submitted this, and it's sworn on the date. Now, is applicant of good moral character? So if you get through all of this and, you know, answer the questions and do whatever, then they can look and say, are you of good moral character? And they can say no. They have to put why. And then, does applicant qualify, right? So they can just say no and then say no. They don't qualify because they're not of good moral character. So it's like that end caveat to, like, if all else fails and someone gets through the system, we might be able to use it if you've committed a crime, right? Well, then we can fail you that way. So even if you, like, were able to answer, do the readings, write it out, write a really good solid understanding of duties of citizenship, have no crimes, and have your home addresses and all that other stuff, they could then, potentially, but if you have a crime, then they could definitely use good moral character. Technically, they could probably try to use it without, even if you said you had no crimes. That would be harder to justify. But if anyone has any crime, and again, a good chunk of the black population had some crime because of the laws of the segregated South and the black codes before that. So it was an easy way to be like, aha, nope, you're not. Or, oh, I heard rumors about this person. It was just a catch-all to be able to, like, throw out the applicant's application if they somehow passed everything else. Now here are the questions, okay? These are just examples. There were more of them, so this is not all of it. And they did not label it with white applicants and black applicants. That was just not listed because the whole point is they were pretending it was equal. So they would have, the polling officials would have a list of readings here, and what they would do is that they would know which ones were for the white applicants and which ones were the black applicants. And then they would just pretend, well, it's just randomly selected, right? So anyone has the possibility to get anything. But if you notice for the white applicants, these are 3 different examples. And again, there were more than this. This just has some. So for the white applicant, then when it was their turn to copy and do the reading, they get short, simple, and straightforward, and relatively easy to read, write, and understand. Easy to, we'll put all of that because it is important. It's all of those. Read, write it out, and understand, because you have to be able to understand it because you do have to write out the interpretation. Right, so let's just look at one. Here, let's look at the easiest one. Section 240, right? This is for the really struggling white applicants. All elections by the people shall be by ballot. You don't have to be super literate to get that. So all you have to write out is this one little sentence. And again, look at the little spaces here. This is not much space. I mean, I'm assuming you could write on a separate piece of paper. We'll have to see for the black applicants. Like, I don't know how you couldn't write all that you needed to in this small space. But for the white applicants, you could, especially that one. All elections by the people shall be by ballot. And then you have to interpret that. I mean, how do you even interpret that different than the sentence? Elections are by ballot. you vote. Elections are done by voting through ballot. I mean, it's basically the sentence. But then look at the other ones too, right? The Senate shall consist of members chosen every 4 years by qualified electors of several districts. That's a little more complicated, right? This is definitely the one of like, oh, that person not super literate. Let's give them this one. But the Senate consists of members chosen every 4 years by electors in different districts. And then all persons resident in this state, citizens of the United States, are hereby declared citizens. So people who live in the state and are citizens of the United States are considered citizens. Not straightforward, easy, not hard to interpret. Now let's look at the Black applicant. This is one, right? There are 3 choices here. This is one choice. Again, there were other choices for Black applicants, but they all kind of looked like this. So you have, look at the difference in size. One tiny little sentence, or still small sentence, and then this freaking paragraph, right? And so for Black applicants, the whole point was that it would be difficult. It would be long. And it would be complex and to understand and interpret. Right? So let's look at this. Here's a goal. When we're in class, when we do this in class, I actually have students try to not only read this, but then write out what does it mean. Because I have to read it multiple times and then break it down sentence by sentence to have it make sense. So think about the level of education you guys have, I have, and then think about the level of education that people in general had back in the late 1800s. And the average person, right? We have a higher level. The average person, for the most part of the U.S., has a higher education level than what people did in the 1800s. So even with that, and being in college or having a college degrees, like this is not an easy one. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to read a couple sentences, but just listen to the jargon. This is intentionally what they picked out for this one. I'll put it here is legal jargon. And they picked legal jargon because, oh my gosh, have you ever tried to read like lawyer affidavit? I can't even say it now. It's too late to be recording this. Yeah, legal documents. There, we'll go with that since my brain stopped working on saying words. They are complicated and there's a ton of legal jargon. And if you don't know it, it's harder. And this is what they've done here with this. This is about tax law, and tax law is boring anyway. And it's complex, and it's got a lot of legal jargon. So but even today, like with you read stuff like with the lawyer, any kind of lawyer document, but even tax code, legal codes, that stuff is so not only boring, but it's often complex because of all the jargon in it. Okay, so let's look at this. The power to tax corporations and their property shall never be surrendered or abridged by any contract or grant to which the state or any political subdivision thereof may be a party, except that the legislature may grant exemption from taxation in the encouragement of manufactures and other new enterprises of public utility, extending for a period of not exceeding 5 years. The time of such exemption to commence from the date of charter, if to a corporation, and if to an individual enterprise, the form of the commencement of work. But when the legislature grants such exemptions for a period of 5 years or less, it shall be done by general laws, blah, blah, blah. It's so ridiculous, right? So then you have to break it down and say, okay, let's see how, so I won't do it. But if you want to really, hopefully just even listening to me say that, you're like, wait, what? Because it doesn't make sense the first time you read it. So then try to break it down yourself and say, okay, let's see if I can put this into my own words, or so that I can interpret it. So I can say, well, what this is saying is that the power of tax corporations and their property are not surrendered or changed by contract or grant, and so on and so on, right? So go through, but you really have to break it down sentence by sentence. It's hard. And so if you're thinking about the level of what it looks like to us now, like imagine how much more difficult it was back then. Let alone, of course, that the average education was not very high. And that was intentional. So they had several choices to give Black applicants that were all like this. Super long, super complex, lots of legal or other normally not used jargon, and meant to be difficult. So the likelihood, and then of course, like if you go back and go, and how are you going to fit it into there? You're not. You have to write on a separate piece of paper. You can't fit it into there. And then somehow, I would be surprised if the polling officials understood the whole thing. And it's still subjective. So you could write it out and then you could give your explanation and they could decide it's not good enough. But they tried to even get to where it eliminates it before that point. So someone reads this and goes, I have no idea, and it does require, if you're just basically literate, this might even be difficult to write out because it's so long. And again, you have very little space to do it. So this was the structure. And the fact, like I said, Ida B. Wells had to take it so many times to pass, and several other well-known women that were part of the women's rights movement and the civil rights movement also found themselves taking this in the progressive era. They wanted the right to vote, and they were taking this multiple times, and were denied, or it took multiple times to pass. And I think that explains the number significant drop too, of where you have over 130,000 to just 1,000 and something, because the average person wasn't going to be able to pass this. And so this is a perfect example of separate but equal too. It's separate, but it's not equal, but they pretend it is. And so this was done. This was meant to intimidate, for sure. That was definitely a part of it, was intimidation. And then also to create a more secure elimination of Black voters. And women were going to even have a harder time because women had less of a chance that they were as fully educated as men. Now, of course, colleges were beginning to open up, and some of them did allow Black women to attend, but you had severe limitations in what colleges you could attend. And what type of study you could do. And so that alone also created limitations for Black women because of what, and education-wise, was available to them. Now we're going to look at, so that was the Redeemers, right? This is in the segregated South, but now we're going to look specifically at segregation itself, for which the name comes from, the segregated South, and Jim Crow laws. So, you have this. There was issues with segregation from the start. So you had segregation before Plessy v. Ferguson. Plessy v. Ferguson is just going to make it legal through the Supreme Court, but there was no single policy in the South for segregation prior to Plessy v. Ferguson. So each state varied in how they approached segregation and what was available. The other issue you had is that there were businesses or companies where you didn't have separate areas. So railroads, theaters, hotels, although some of that will change. Right, and diners, like restaurants and things like that, admitted everyone. But they didn't admit everyone. They did exclude Black people. What they did is they only had one place, one area to admit people. And so this meant that two things happened with that, really, was that either, actually a couple different things. Is one, there was some exclusion initially, although the Plessy v. Ferguson will make that where you, if you don't have separate, you can't exclude. Exclusion for black people, like they just wouldn't let them in, but the railroads didn't because it was a federal thing because they usually went from state to state, or you had to sit in the back. There was also rear entrances, so you couldn't go in the front door. And then some had separate facilities. Although, like I said, the ones I listed tended to not have separate facilities. And this is where the ones that didn't have separate facilities, like the railroads and theaters and hotels initially, Plessy v. Ferguson is going to come into play. So because there wasn't a clear policy, I mean, it was like you had a different experience in every state you went. Black women especially disliked the issues with public transportation. So the railroads and later buses and things like that. Public transportation was necessary for many women to get to jobs. And there was either exclusion in some cases. A lot of public transportation simply had regulations that you couldn't be in certain areas. So one of the things that a lot of public transportation had in the early 1800s were ladies' cars. And ladies' cars were a separate car just for women. And the reason for this was seen as a way for women to feel safer, to be protected, and just the idea of, modesty and security with just being women rather than being harassed by the men or being in close proximity to men. And they usually had, then they had white cars, and then separate cars for a black person to go into. So we'll put that too. Segregated cars. Well, Ida B. Wells, we're going to talk about her a couple of times. She went into the ladies' car. There was only one car for the ladies' car. And in Tennessee, and they kicked her out and made her go to the black car, saying you can't. The ladies' car was only for white women, but they didn't have a ladies' car for black women. So she actually sued the Tennessee Railroad Company for not for kicking her out of the ladies' car. So before even Plessy v. Ferguson, Ida B. Wells was suing based on this. This didn't go national though, right? And I think that's one of the biggest reasons that you don't hear about it as often, because it didn't create the federal Supreme Court decision that Plessy v. Ferguson did. This was dealt internally with the Tennessee Railroad Company. So then you have Homer Plessy, who 12 years later sues the Louisiana Railroad Company. His, though, is different, right? So she was suing because of the ladies' car and being kicked out of that and not having a ladies' car. So Homer Plessy sued them for its segregation policies. So just that there were segregated cars, right? So slightly different, both with public transportation, But his was more overarching, that the fact that they had segregated cars, and of course the black cars that were designated for the black people were not in good condition, and the white cars, of course, were a lot nicer. So this ends up going to the Supreme Court, and you get Plessy v. Ferguson as the case. And what was significant about this is that the Supreme Court said that states have the right to create separate but equal facilities. Of course, the thing with that is that they were never equal. But that became the big part, spiel of segregation. Separate but equal for facilities. And this became the united system of Southern segregation. And it kick-started off, once this law came into being, it kick-started off a whole bunch of laws and rules. So where it had been informal, which could be bad or good, because some of the informality there wasn't segregation. The states kind of did it as they wanted, and some were more consistent with segregation or exclusion than others. After Plessy v. Ferguson, the states immediately began setting up laws to segregate. So that becomes the official segregated, or segregation of the South, or segregation, is once you actually have these laws. Because there weren't a lot of laws. There wasn't any laws. It was more like just the expectation of cultural practice of what they did. And now they had legal justification, because that was part of the thing, is I think a lot of the states didn't know if they actually had the legal justification to do this. And so they were doing it. It's not like it wasn't happening, but it wasn't everywhere. It wasn't a uniform policy that every facility, every facet of life practiced in the South. Now you had the Supreme Court legal justification to do this. And so, like, literally, states immediately as this judgment came down set up laws for segregation. And the whole point was to separate. And so from that, you have a separation of, every aspect of life. We're gonna write out a few examples, but the reality is that women and women, but women experienced every facet of their daily life was now a constant reminder of being inferior and being treated as inferior, being told you're inferior, and also white supremacy. And that's what the South wanted. That's what the Redeemers had wanted, was to prove over and over in every facet of life that we're better than you. And you could not escape it in the South. There was some there was segregation in schools in the North, largely with the Chinese population. So see, I'll put that in a minute when we talk about it. The North didn't have segregation before the black population, and they didn't have a widespread uniform segregated aspect, but things were unofficially segregated. So I'll talk about the North in just a second with it, but the South was far more comprehensive. The North, it varied, and it was mostly unofficial. So every facet of life, drinking, you were out and about, and you wanted to get a drink, drinking fountains were separated. Restaurants were either separate or if you did not have separate facilities, then you had to provide access. So that was part of the laws. At least they could not exclude anymore. But it made it far worse, the segregated aspect of it. You could not exclude. but you could separate out. So while they couldn't exclude people, it meant that that was where you had the rear door entrance or sitting in the back. So they would just segregate sections of areas for Black people. But it did require that it was separate but equal. If they had that was legal. Otherwise, you had to have people in. So like public transportation didn't have two different buses, so they had to be able to ride the bus. That did mean that with Ida B. Wells, right, that if they had a ladies' car, they had to have one for Black women as well. But of course, the conditions in all of these things were awful and few and far between. Let's give a couple more examples. Parks, public swimming pools, and when they could, they tried for separation. Bathrooms, the bus. Every public system, right? You could keep going on. Schools, libraries. Schools were a big one. We'll stop with libraries. Right, so every kind of facet of daily life is then there to create a reinforcement of white power and supremacy. And then with this, you had the reality that the separate facilities were intentionally and definitely intentionally, we'll say here, we'll put, because it's a couple things, were poor condition and quality. They often were further away. So one of the things, this will come later with Brown versus Board of Education, which is later on down the road. But that what you would have is the problem would be is so that if you wanted your daughter to go to school, there could be a white school a couple miles from your home, but the Black school was like 10 miles away. But that didn't matter because there was a limit of how far away is far away, but it could be pretty far away. And so there was also less options. So it was further away, and so then your daughter would have to walk to school a lot further to go to the school, which was poor condition and quality, had really old books, was run down. The taxes, they did not provide equal taxes for funding, right? So public facilities that got, like schools, that got taxes from the state for stuff, they didn't give equal amounts to each group. But less options too. So if you were out and about going shopping and you needed to go to the bathroom, the likelihood of finding a bathroom nearby was slim. You would often have to walk quite a ways before the next bathroom, where in time you could have passed two different white restrooms. So there were just less options available, and they were further away. And it was all, and then if even in the places where you had to sit in the back, or that they'd let you in, right, there usually was this constant kind of concern and fear for safety, because there was always this, like, right, the idea was that they were meant to be reminders of white control and power. And what comes with that, even for women were not immune from this, was the violence to reinforce it. And so women found themselves, and they also, some of the times where these facilities were placed were in more dangerous areas. And so women found themselves having, you know, if you have to go, you plan basically if you're going to go out shopping not to have to use the bathroom, and having a place to stay. There were less available places if you needed a hotel, or even like certain stores, right? Well, they're like, well, this store is only for white people because there's a clothing store for black people, you know, 15 miles down the road. But if you're thinking pre-car, that's a ways to go. It's enough as it is with driving in a car. Far, far further when you don't have cars yet to do this. Now, with the connection to violence to reinforce it, right? They had strict laws and rules in enforcing this. And even if they didn't, you had social expectation by the white people that would reinforce it with violence, and sometimes both. So you had fines that were for if you used a white drinking fountain, you could get jail time. You could also have physical violence where you were attacked by bystanders, we'll call it, right? People who were around that were white that saw you. And so they used the threat of jail, the threat of fines, which of course, remember, jail for men especially had chain gangs, which was harsh labor and potentially deadly. They used fines in jail as well as physical violence. There was also a threat for women with sexual violence and rape. So, right, the added aspect of women if they were alone, and in certain circumstances, even if it didn't happen, the threat of it would be used against them. And that very much was targeted at women to instill fear for compliance. And I mean, that's really the segregated South. It's all about this level of fear as well as normalcy in everyday, like, so you're just bombarded with this nonstop. Okay, so that gets us to Jim Crow, which is also about the whole bombardment of control and white supremacy. The idea of Jim Crow, well, let's start with like the back aspect of it. Jim Crow was a name of a character in a minstrel show. And remember, if you watch the video, he talks about, we don't know exactly where it first started. The first reference to the name Jim Crow is in a minstrel show. Whether it was around prior to that, that's just the first record we have of it. And the minstrel shows were done with a white actor in blackface. And blackface itself was used, let's put that here, as an intentional form of mockery and belittling. It was meant to, and it was Jim Crow too. Like, so blackface was both, and before the word, like before Jim Crow laws and before all these other products became part of that Jim Crow culture, the minstrel show and blackface was done to mock and belittle black men and women. It started off as men with Jim Crow, and then they started using blackface for women as well. And it was meant to create, and Jim Crow in general, here, I'm going to put it back here because this is both blackface. See, blackface and Jim Crow kind of merge into a thing. It was meant to play off of caricatures and exaggerated stereotypes. of not even closely resembling a real person to reinforce racism. So the idea was, Jim Crow started it. The Jim Crow character, I guess I should have added with the character, was, let's see, I'll do it over here because I should have added into specifically what the first Jim Crow character was like. He was meant to be comical. It was always a comical in the beginning, right? We're going to look at how it changes. It was always a comical character, the original Jim Crow. And it was meant to also have him be somewhat stupid, essentially. So he was of low intelligence. And like the buffoon is the word that's used, which I think is a good descriptor of it as well. But that low intelligence was meant to then play off of comical, where then people laughed at that buffoonery. And then they re-emphasized, right, the whole point of that was emphasizing these stereotypes and physical stereotypes. So it exaggerated, we'll put that one here, physical traits, as well as what actions, as reinforce, exaggerate stereotypes, reinforce. So one of the big things would be traits. Others will be behaviors. So there's going to be an over-exaggeration and emphasis on certain types of behavior, as well as just general actions. Well, one of it's going to be work and labor. We're going to talk about each of these. And then just general stereotypes that emerge as far as roles too. We'll put roles in society. Okay, so that was kind of that. So the very first Jim Crow that's referenced, it was a man who was a white man playing a black man in blackface, and his character was one. It was in a song first that then became a minstrel show, and it was meant to be comical, but the comedy was the buffoonery of the person, and then kind of like that they didn't know that they were being ridiculous or of low intelligence, and then that was the part of it too. It was meant for the audience to laugh at him, not with him. Right, so it's very much making fun of that character. So there were some very key characteristics of how it was viewed. Let's look at women first. We'll put men just so that you have both on there. For women, for both men and women, there were two main types. And the first was an older woman who was meant to be harmless and caring. She was in the domestic sphere, right? Usually with housekeeping. Always domestic work, serving white people. Almost always seen as a larger motherly figure, right? Which goes definitely back to the reference of like the personal slaves who raised the children in with the plantation owners. And the key with this was also that non-sexual. So that she might have children of her own, but you don't ever see it. It's like an imply that yes, she has children or had children. She's older, harmless and caring, definitely all domestic work, serving white people, larger motherly figure, non-sexual. right? So that's one. I should have put the two different types. So that's one. We'll just go down here and start over. And then the one type. The other type was, well, it could play in two parts, but it was the sexualized version. The thing with this one is it could be either older women, but also children. So young girls were then sexualized in images. So in this case, you have pictures or postcards where you have a young girl like that is like a 8 to 10-year-old and pregnant. This usually was that they would be shown naked or mostly naked. And usually there was an aspect of seduction. They were looking like they were seducing. So this is the other type. This was the dangerous type. Dangerous and bad type. This was supposed to be the good type. Okay, and then for men, right? You had, just like within these two groups here, okay, you had the one type, which was that they were older, they were non-sexual. I mean, it was very similar. Also a servant, but obviously not in the domestic sphere. And was usually, again, lower intelligence, that comical buffoonery kind of thing. So this is the non-threatening, the harmless type, which was also seen as the good type. You could argue that the women in the portrayals was often a little more positive, not by much, but a little bit more than men. The other type was, again, the sexualized version, which could also be a young boy, usually who was naked or partially naked. So very similar, right? There's the one difference with this is that this was seen as much more dangerous. Dangerous to women, white women. So this gets connected to raping white women. There was sometimes also the idea that women, if it wasn't rape, women were seduced. Not by the young children. Often, although it still did show it in super sexualized ways sometimes, were seduced right? So it's either they're raping white women or women were seduced. White women were seduced by them. And this one was, there was also a level of violence attached to, not just attached, what would be a better word? Put on this version. A violence portrayed against these characteristics, against any kind of Jim Crow figure or caricature. We'll say this type of character. So what I mean by this is that they had that there was violence showing being done to the character, this type of caricature, because they were dangerous to women. then you get a reinforcement of violence. More so women sometimes, but for, men a lot, that there was this violence shown. So they had games. If you watch the video, it showed that they had games where it was encouraging people to be violent to these caricatures and figures. There was a postcard of a young naked boy, and it said alligator bait, right? And that meant to be the violence of killing them by throwing them to the alligators. There was another one that was shown with, what was it, the throwing a ball at the person's face, which they often used. They used real people in fairs sometimes too, but they also had a game for it where it was a cutout. So the idea of that this was very dangerous. The women's caricature was dangerous. The black men's caricature, this one was very dangerous. So these were the different ways that women and men were portrayed. And then what they did is they put them into these characters, or caricatures really, were put into everyday objects. And literally anything and everything you could think of was made into an object. Salt shakers, games, postcards. Salt shakers are probably the most common thing. You can still find those at antique shops, because they made so many of them. They're still easy. Like I feel like every time I go to an antique store, they're there somewhere, because they were so prolific. Everything was, but by far the salt shakers, salt and pepper shakers, I should say. It's both. I won't change it, but it's salt and pepper. It was a man and a woman, and it was the positive version, the non-threatening version. Again, it wasn't positive. That should be in quotations, right? I put in a quotations of good, positive version. It was the non-threatening version. It was still a very negative connotation of reinforcing superiority, white control and superiority, and racism. It reinforced domestic service for women and reinforced that their role was to serve white families, and to do so with this happy, that would be another thing in there, that they were always, for women, always happy and pleasant. Happy to serve, right? It's kind of, it reinforced that older myth with the slaves, that the slaves were happy, right? If you took good care of them, they were happy. And so the idea of the salt and pepper shakers were part of that domestic one. So it was the first two versions. It was for women. It was almost anything that had to do with the kitchen was connected to that specific image of the larger, older woman who was happy to serve white people, and never got upset, and always, her only care was for the white population. Postcards, games, it was on signs and advertisements. Pictures, any type of figurine, and a ton of different for women. A lot of different cooking utensils and kitchen, gadgets, I guess, kitchen stuff. Definitely for women, that one was a big one. Okay, so what I want to do is just, you probably have watched the video. I'm only going to show a brief clip of it, specifically where it's looking at women and the different ways that they are portrayed in all of these objects. And one of the things I hope you got out of the video was just how many things it was in. Like the whole, and what was the point, right, of why everyday objects? So that it becomes, the idea is right, that it so inundates everyone that it becomes normal and acceptable and part of everyday life. And this was done for a couple reasons. One, to normalize the racism and the stereotypes that they wanted to portray. The other reason was to be a constant reminder of control. It was also to indoctrinate. It was for white children as well, right? Specifically, there's normalized racism for the general population, to grow up believing this is all how this was always this way. So they don't question, right? They don't question white authority and control. And this goes both ways, for white children and for black children, right? So if you inundate it, and so it becomes super pervasive. It just worked it was intentionally pervasive to work its way into every aspect of life, that you could not, the whole point was that you could not avoid it. If you went out into public, you could not avoid these things. And so then it normalizes it, and it reinforces that these are the roles for black women, and that there were those two, the dangerous or a one that was a happy servant to white people, and there was nothing else in between. And it was meant to normalize that the only job for women then was really to be within the domestic sphere of a domestic servant, that there wasn't any other role for black women. It was meant to normalize the violence mostly towards black men, but to normalize it and reinforce it to black women as well, that this was acceptable to do. So that you didn't question, so you didn't challenge, because it was so pervasive in every single thing. Okay, so what we're going to do is just look, I'm just going to play, for those who haven't watched the video yet, or just as a reminder, we're just going to watch the small part of the clip of where he talks about women. So
we decided to use as much as possible a home motif for the museum. Here we have a kitchen, and in that kitchen we have Mammy. Mammy was one of the dominant caricatures of African American women. She was dark, she was a large woman, she was, at least by American standards, an unattractive woman. She had children, and yet she was often perceived as being desexualized. She was loyal to a fault. And that image of Mammy became this image that many white Americans associated with wholesomeness. So her face was placed on breakfast foods and other kitchen-related objects. And so what we did here is to put literally dozens of Mammy images in a kitchen. All racial and ethnic groups have been caricatured in the...
So just again, it didn't zoom in as much as I was wanting with showing all of them, but the point of, right, the women, if you watch the whole video, and look at like where men are shown and where women are shown, women were almost always put into that domestic sphere, which is not surprising because that's ultimately where all women tended to get put. But that's also, I think, a good point that they mentioned that I didn't write down in here, that one of the things that they usually emphasized was um, darker color for all of these. We put that with the physical traits, right? Because it definitely was that reinforcement of that dark was bad. That it goes back to black is slave, white is free. But that there were different levels of being black, even though there wasn't with the one drop idea, and that if you're black, you're black, and yet that the reinforcement of being darker skinned was a negative, although within this, in some he mentioned wholesome like way, but that still was to reinforce that difference between like black and white not being equal, but also the idea that the darker skinned women and men were somehow more potentially dangerous or different, and more inferior, and that definitely is something that you still see, like that's still there's still issues with that today, and not just in the US. In India, lighter skin is definitely desired, and they have like whitening products to try to lighten your skin, and that has to do with the caste system. And there's other areas as well, but even in the US, like that's still this idea and it's connected back to, of course, with white and the idea of whiteness as better, because that's the whole point, was to make it a clear contrast, to separate clearly. So that was the point. I put physical traits, but I didn't specify there. So this then is like, so again, the whole idea of putting it into everyday products, to put it into everything so that you can't avoid it. All aspects of life get reinforced in the South, and this one into the North too. But it's meant to reinforce that component of it. The one thing I want to mention with the North, and then we'll talk about violence and lynching. So let's see, 6. Segregation and the North. So with the North, I'm gonna have to pause this anyways. I'm almost out of battery and I don't want this to die on me. Hang on just a second. All right, so with segregation and the North, there was no official laws or policy. But what you did have were, where there was more likely to be specific policy, was actually with Chinese and Chinese American. Here you had actual initial bar from education. And then when in the book, he actually has a letter from a mom who writes about her daughter, and she takes him to court, and then they do create segregated schools and this was in San Francisco, for Chinese American students. So you have an official, somewhat, again, wasn't universal though. That was very specific, a localized law that they did. But you do have a lot of discrimination against the Chinese and Chinese Americans in the North, which definitely had a role in with the Chinese Exclusion Act, as well as earlier with the Chinese that had come over and helped build the railroads and the gold rush. And so there definitely was discrimination and segregation in that. You also had in general for unofficial segregation, where in work, factories was a big one. And this comes into play too later with World War I, when women were working in the factories, but even before that. And they had separate areas for black and white women. And then, of course, just in pay, it's not really segregation, but there was definitely lower pay for women, and then lower pay for black women. So women in general got paid less than men, and then black women got paid less than white women. And then you did have individual businesses. So a lot of the North was not segregated. We'll say various forms of segregation, and there were no laws, and there were plenty of areas where there wasn't any segregation at all, but there definitely were individual businesses that practiced segregation. And there obviously was racism in the North, and that didn't go away. But so I just wanted to point that out, that in your book there's in the middle of the chapter there's a letter that a woman writes, a Chinese woman writes about her daughter, for her two daughters, that they were set up in San Francisco, expecting that their daughters would get to go to school there, and then they were not enrolled. They were prohibited from going to the school, and so she took the case to court. And it was that they had to set up facilities for them, but they could be separate. So they either had to let them in or create a separate facility, so they created a separate area for them to go, a separate school. But so there was an attempt even to just deny the opportunity to go to be educated. So that was definitely a huge issue. All right, so we're going to look at Ida B. Wells and lynching. We talked about the aspect of violence used to reinforce the segregation and Jim Crow, and Ida B. Wells was an activist that we mentioned, right, that had sued the railroad company for the ladies' car, but she was a lifelong activist towards against discrimination, and she ends up being a journalist as well. And writes about lynching, specifically for the North. It was for the South too, but it was for the North. And it was meant to have people become aware about lynching. And again, that might seem something that, like, well, should they know? Yes and no. Also created women's groups to fight segregation and violence against black women and in general. So she was well known for all of her different work. So the thing with lynching is that the North knew about it, and occasionally a lynching happened in the North, but it was mostly a Southern thing, and it tied to segregation, because it was the violence to, with what the Redeemers set up with the segregated South to reinforce white superiority and control, and definitely had its roots in the KKK. The North was aware of it, but just kind of like with slavery and like with the Grimsky sisters and that desire to hear the details that they wouldn't know, yes, the pictures and postcards of people being lynched did pass around, but it was far less common in the North than in the South. Even the pictures and the postcards that were made, it didn't mean they didn't get sent to the North, but the average person, these things weren't in stores like they were in the South. They weren't as prevalent as they were in the South. And they certainly weren't talked about in the newspaper in the South, in the North. Consequently, they may know about lynching, but not the full extent. Plus, she's also going to talk about, in the reading I had you look at, why there was kind of a specific way it was set up so that people wouldn't question it. So then you don't look into it more deeply and you don't understand the true horrors of what's going on, or its true purpose. And that's going to be a big part of what she's going to do, is not only have people be aware of how often it was happening and how horrible it was, but also its true purpose, right? We've been told one thing, and she's kind of like, and I'm here to tell you that's not the truth. And then let me tell you the real truth about it. And so trying, and of course, just the realization that if you were going to get activism and people that were going to push against it, it was going to be people from the North, not the South. It would, one, because it'd be harder to do in the South. She actually had to leave because it was dangerous for her to be in the South. So activists tended to get killed in the South, whether you were black or white. If you started pushing back against the whole segregated component of the South, against racism, violence happened to you, because the whole system was set around that violence to create fear, to create terror, so that you didn't challenge the system. And so she pushed back and she challenged the system and had to leave in order not to be killed, and then worked from the North to get the North to become activists, to be aware of it, and to push back and try to get change for that. But then also, like I said, expanded into, she created a whole women's group of women pushing back and being activists, and being involved and pushing against racism and lynching. So lynching, we're going to look at her in just a minute what she wrote. So lynching itself was, as we mentioned, done to create fear and terror in order to maintain control. It also we'll say, had its roots with the Klan. Why it didn't need to be the Klan anymore, right? Why did the Klan dissipate? Well, the KKK began to dissipate because, here, let me put the whole thing there, right? The KKK was not as involved or around even anymore at this time, because the need for secrecy was no longer there. People were doing this in the open, in public, taking pictures. It was out in the open, and people were not punished for it. So you didn't need the Klan with the hoods and hiding yourself and all of that type of stuff. And also, the other reason being from the earlier laws against it during Reconstruction. So that had helped move it away. But again, the biggest thing was this: the fact that the need for secrecy was no longer prevalent in that aspect of it. Lynching was not through a court system. right? It had nothing to do with the law, although they're going to claim that it was based on law. It was mob violence, and it could either be planned or unplanned. Not very creative with my wording at the moment. So it's the idea that it was always mob violence. It could be large or small groups. It could be there were planned lynchings that took place where they put them in the newspaper, and it had like, here's the day set in time, and people would go. It was meant to be a public event a lot of the times, even if it was smaller, right? And so that could be just a small group, or it could be a large group that was put into the newspaper, and families and people would go, and people would attend to specifically to show up to a lynching. And they brought their children. And like I said, and took pictures and made it an event. Took pictures, put it on postcards and newspapers. So this was not a secret thing, not a private thing. It was meant to be public, and it was meant to be public because public served as a warning and that fear and terror, right? To all other Black people, don't do this or this will happen to you. Don't challenge us. Don't try to think that you get to do these things because then this will happen to you. So it had to be public to work within that, the way that they wanted it to. Now, what froze up here? So lynching technically could fall under a couple of different things. It's not moving smoothly there when I was trying to scroll. Traditionally, lynching, what was it? A hanging of, well, it wasn't always a Black person, but majority of the time it was the hanging of a Black person. But it wasn't, hangings were the most common. However, there was usually other violence. It could be any physical violence against someone outside of the law. Usually, I mean, the whole purpose was that it resulted in death. There were very few cases where that wasn't the end result. Otherwise, it would be an attempted lynching. The active purpose of lynching was either to hang someone, usually a Black person, usually Black men, but women were lynched as well. And there are extremely violent stories of women being lynched. There was a woman whose husband was lynched, and when she went and complained and protested about it, she was handed over by the cops to a mob who lynched her, and she was pregnant, and they cut out her baby and then killed it. And that type of violence was there was no lesser or lessening of violence in lynching between men and women. It just happened more for men because it got connected and used for justification with the idea that Black men were threatening and raping white women, and therefore they were lynching them because of that. And so since it got connected to that type of violence, or that type of action as the justification for why they were lynching people, it tended to be men more often. But women were lynched as well. And there wasn't there was no reprieve for being a woman in that type of violence. And it could be any physical violence. So technically, it didn't have to be someone who was hanged. A lynching could take form of being beaten to death by a mob, burned to death, tortured, and usually there was torture before or during being hung. So you weren't just hung. You usually, before you were hanged, you were tortured and beaten. And it was meant to be public. All with the purpose of reinforcing white control and supremacy and creating a form of terror to prevent other people from pushing back. And some because they were just sadist as well. You have all those other justifications, but it was because people still didn't see others as human beings and thought it was perfectly acceptable to do this to people. Let's see. We'll put it with what was it? It was claimed. Let's say we'll do this, that the those who supported or participated justified it by claiming largely that this was their main justification, that black men were raping white women, and so therefore they deserved it. And also that it was hard. And Ida B. Wells, we're going to look at this in a second because she does a good job of explaining it. Also the idea that right, it was harder than she says it was harder to then defend it, and I don't think it would be harder to defend the cruelty and brutality of it, but the idea of they immediately would turn on, oh, so you're defending men raping women, and then you'd be like, no, that's not what I'm saying. Oh yeah, you are. If you're saying it's okay for men to rape women and it's okay, we're protecting this gets into specifically the idea of protecting the virtue of white women. That was what was used as the justification. It was not that at all, but that was what was used. So let's look. I'm going to put up again. Sorry, I can't. There is no online version of this. It's in your book, but I want to look over. I want to highlight a few points besides just reading it. So I'm going to throw it up on here. I know that's somewhat clunky, but it's the only way to show it and kind of highlight it as I'm talking about it, which is much easier than having you hope that you're just paying attention to what I'm saying. You can also see it and follow along in your book. This one is in your book with Ida B. Wells. So I took a picture of just 2 of the pages that I wanted to look at the part, and then we'll talk about it. All right. So I had to take the picture this way because apparently there's if I only have to hold the camera a certain way, or it always puts it sideways on here. So we get the side of it, but we're looking at this main part here. Okay, so she's talking about what made her realize that there was that what had been said with lynching was not true, or what the story that they'd been told over and over again about why lynching happened was not true at all. And so it's talking about this grocery store, and there was a grocery store there was only one grocery store owned by this white man, and then you had a grocery store that was operated by these 3 people: Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Henry Stewart. And they were black, and the other grocery store owner who had been there was white, and that this lynching that took place happened because of the essentially business, economic reasons. Henry Stewart. Okay, and so she's going to claim that she's going to show how that there was the lynching that took place because of this. Was because of economic reasons. And the thing with this, right, is she's saying like there was nothing in this case had anything to do about a white woman or rape or any sexual assault. It was entirely because of the white grocer who was not happy with that, right? There was a grocery store owned and operated by a white man who hitherto had a monopoly on the trade of this thickly populated colored suburb. Thomas's grocery changed all that, and he and his associates were made to feel that they were not welcome. It's being weird with writing. They were not welcomed by the white grocer, right? So he didn't like with this story. Then the white grocer had a monopoly until these three men started their store. Okay, so that's the background of it. And what happens is, so then it talks about this game with marbles, right? And there was and it got into a fight. So most likely that fight led to a threat that they were going to come and on Saturday night and clean out Thomas's Colored People's Grocery Company. According to the grocery company, armed several men and stationed them in the rear of the store. Oh, my pen does not like writing on this for some reason. They armed the men on the store on that fatal Saturday night, not to attack, but to repel a threatened attack. The men stationed there had seen several white men stealing through the rear door and fired on them without a moment's pause. 3 of these men were wounded, and others fled and gave the alarm. Over 100 colored men were dragged from their homes and put in jail on suspicion. Okay, so it's convoluted a little bit. So it starts with the grocery store. Then you have children playing marbles. And this leads to a fight, which then leads to a threat to steal and ransack, destroy the men's grocery store. It doesn't explain how it went from A to B, other than the kids went home and told their parents, I'm guessing, because they were playing marbles. It was between a group of white and black kids. And so I'm guessing they got into a fight, and then they went home and told their parents. And then that turned to a threat of, how dare your black kids, fight with our white kids. We're going to come destroy your grocery. She also argues that that she believes that this was instigated by the white grocer who suggested, let's hit this store. And the reason he suggested let's hit this store was because he didn't like that he didn't have a monopoly in the area anymore. So then the men's grocery store, the 3 men's grocery store arms themselves to defend from being looted. being looted and destroyed. This leads to, as it's described in there, them shooting and injuring some white people that were looting the store. This then leads to over 100 black men, right? She says being dragged from their homes and put in jail. So they just basically, the police went and rounded up all the black men they could find in the area because they didn't know who did it. They didn't know who shot and stuff that way. This leads to, okay, what's the next part of this, right? Because again, this is a little bit convoluted story. All day long on that fateful Sunday, white men were permitted in the jail to look over the imprisoned black men. The mob took out of their cells Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Henry Stewart, the three officials of the People's Grocery Company. And so this allowed white men to pick out the three grocery owners, the three grocery store owners, right? And then that led to them lynching them. They were loaded on a switch engine of the railroad, which ran back of the jail, carried a mile north of the city limits, and horribly shot to death. Right, so there's an example of lynching that they were hung, they were shot to death, but it's still lynching. And so then they were lynched. And again, while lynching is traditionally being hung, it doesn't have to be. It's any mob violence is a lynching. With the intent to kill, because there's assault, but the lynching is the intent to kill, whether it happens or not, or planning to, essentially. So like that's the being shot to death, being beat to death by a group outside of the law. And on the morning, papers held back the edition and to supply its readers with the details of the lynching. The mob took possession of the People's Grocery Company, helping themselves to food and drink, and destroyed what they could not eat or steal. The creditors had the place closed, and a few days later, what remained of the stock was sold at auction. Thus, with the aid of the city and county authorities of the daily papers, that white grocer had indeed put an end to the rival black business. Right? And that's what she's saying. Look, he used lynching and the city and the newspapers to get rid of his competition. And she said, so this, like many another person who had read of the lynchings in the South, I had accepted the ideas meant to be conveyed, that although lynching was irregular and contrary to law and order, unreasoning anger over the terrible crime of rape led to the lynchings, that perhaps the brute deserved death anyhow, and the mob was justified in taking his life. Here, I'm going to do this part here. Right? She says, this whole paragraph's important. So she said, right, I, like many others, had accepted what the South's justification and propaganda that they had said. That lynching was irregular. And yes, it was, they acknowledged, contrary to law and order, but it was because of the anger over the terrible crime of rape. So, what number are we on? 4. The propaganda of lynching. One, that it was irregular. It happened quite frequently in the South. And that it was over justified anger over rape. And so they deserved it. Right? That was the idea behind it. But Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Henry Stewart had been lynched in Memphis, one of the leading cities in the South, in which no lynching had taken place before, with just as much brutality as other victims of the mob, and they had committed no crime against white women. So see, right, she uses a story to say all this story happened, shows and proves. That's why the story is important to understand, because she's saying this proved that lynching was not what the South was saying. And it had nothing to do with white women whatsoever. This is what opened my eyes to what lynching really was, an excuse to get rid of black people who were acquiring wealth and property and thus kept the race terrorized, right? So that it was, she ties it directly more specifically to economics. I would argue it was also it wasn't just to keep them economically down, it was to keep them socially down. It was both. Like that there was an idea that anyone who got too financially well off could then somehow move past their station, and it's that you think you're better than your place in society kind of thing. So she's arguing that, right, that it was economic. Wells argued it was about preventing economic status and success. And then what I would say with that is it was economic, but it was also social. The superiority and control, right? That you have, that both of those played a role into it. Many cases were like that of the lynching that happened in Mississippi. The Associated Press reporter said the big burly brute. So here she's giving an example now. The big burly brute was lynched because he had raped the 7-year-old daughter of the sheriff. I visited the place afterwards and saw the girl, who was a grown woman more than 17 years old. Right, so the newspaper, she also claims, right, that the newspaper, the media, helped reinforce this. Because they told the narrative that they wanted to be told. So they say here, right, that it was not, she was not a girl, a 7-year-old. She was not raped. At all, and that it was that he had led the mob. She'd been found. So this one claims that she was just having sex with him, and then to save his daughter's reputation, he claimed that that she was raped. And this did happen. That white women, either willingly or unwillingly, they're both cases, falsely accused black men of raping them, and that led to their lynching and their deaths. And this was something that people knew in the South, both women and the men, who sometimes they felt they had to claim that. Other times they were forced to by their family, and other times they chose to, and knew that the power of that protecting white women would sway people to violence. Not that they needed a lot of help in doing that. So she wrote a story in response to this. She shares what she wrote that pissed him off, right? She's like, if Southern white men are not careful, they will overreach themselves, and a conclusion will be drawn which will be very damaging to the moral reputation of their women. She's basically saying, like, you keep claiming rape, but eventually people are going to stop believing that, and then we're going to all suspect that your daughters are just sleeping around and having sex with the black men rather than being raped by them. And that, that they're basically, this was very much a like, yeah, you claim it's this, but we all know it's this instead. Then that pissed a lot of people off, that statement there. And let's see. she talks about her paper for a little bit and the consequences of stuff. She also compares it to, which is important, right? This complex relationship between well, both the forced rape of slave women with the owners, and that been going on forever, but the instant was reversed, not the rape part, but having sex with white women having sex with black men, it was now unacceptable, and the contradiction in that. So she talks about that as well, that you have this long history of black women being raped, and that's completely acceptable by white men, but the instant it's not rape but just sex, white women having sex with black men, it is completely unacceptable. Right, she says it's also well known that many other such white fathers and masters had children. Right, and she says even that that even that she's known all my life, I've known such conditions were accepted as a matter of course. I found that this rape of helpless black girls and women, which began in slavery days, still continued without hindrance, check, or reproof from church, state, or press until there had been created this race within a race. So that, right, then she brings into the point that with women, black women, not only were raped and it's seen as a matter of course in slavery, but that the rape of black women by white men was still going on with no reproach by the church, by the state, with no one speaking out. Right, so that you have this violence on black women from not only slavery but to that current day of when she's writing this, and that's not discussed. That's not somehow horrible. So she claimed, right, we're protecting women. She's like, no, you're protecting white women, and you're not even protecting white women. You're protecting this sense of reputation based on that. But she's like, you can't claim that this is about the protection of women's virtue, because that's what they did. They didn't come out always and say we're protecting white women. They said we're protecting women's virtue from rapists. And she said, no, you're not, because white owners, these white men were raping their slave women all the time. And to this day, black women are still being raped, and no one says anything about it. So you can't claim that you're protecting women's virtue, because clearly you don't care about black women's virtue at all. And you're not really, and then she goes on, you're not really protecting white women's virtue either. You just don't like that they're having sex with black men. And more importantly, that's really even not the point. That kickstarts off the anger, but the main point of the lynchings isn't even that anyways. It's just an excuse to do the lynchings, because then it goes to this idea, right, that the rape of white women is just the excuse to lynch someone, specifically because if a black man is having sex with a white woman, then he, I guess she too, doesn't know his place. Right, this is the actual reason for lynching. Right, and so then they need to reinforce that that's not acceptable. Not just because of the sex, but because it's what was seen as a blatant sign of I can do what I want, and they're saying no, you can't. That's not acceptable. You're beneath white people, so therefore you cannot have sex with white people, because then it's just suggesting that you're somehow suggesting that you're brother. So what's interesting with this, right, is that lynching involves women in two different ways. You have three different ways, I suppose. One, you have women who are lynched themselves and have that fear. Four different ways. I'm going to go, there's four, and probably more. I'll keep coming up with them. Then the next one is that then it impacts women, wives and daughters, black women in general, because lynching was meant to terrorize all black people, not just the men that were being lynched most of the time. Lynching was meant to be a constant reminder through violence of your place in society, whether you were a man or a woman. Then you have the aspect of black women being raped and them using the excuse of protecting women's virtue, but clearly not women's virtue. They didn't care what happened to black women. And so then you have this other reminder of women who are being raped, and yet there is no protection for them. And then you have white women who are being used to justify lynching, who sometimes are active participants and other times just unwilling participants in it based on the circumstance. And that so women, from both white and black women, are involved in this in many different ways, and how it impacted them, how it was used, excuses or propaganda that was made to reinforce it. And so she's bringing that up. She was very specific in this about showcasing women's involvement in the lynchings, even as they, like I said, largely happened to men. That women, there were so many different ways that women were involved in this, whether it was to induce fear, whether it was to use them, whether they used it to benefit themselves, or whether that it was used for terror and control, or just a repeated show of how that you as a woman, a black woman, were not valued. It's okay if you get raped, whatever, right? But white women, even though they aren't even being raped, that we're gonna make a big show of. Right, and she continues talking about it, that she couldn't get over that the Southerner had never gotten over his resentment that black people were no longer his plaything, his servant, his source of income. So that's part of it too, right? That there was still that resentment of them no longer being slaves. So that was another piece of, she's arguing for this violence, for lynching that took place. And there was protective laws during Reconstruction that had made a mockery by the white South, where it had not secured their repeal. The same white South had secured political control of its several states, and as soon as white Southerners came into power, they immediately began to institute lynching. Right? So that was like the idea. She's claiming that Reconstruction, when there was that short period of time where black people in the South had political power, where they had their freedoms and they could express them, that was seen as a mockery to white Southerners. And so as soon as then they got back control and Reconstruction ended, they immediately moved towards the violence of lynching, based on that resentment and the desire for control. And then she does talk about specifically that lynching was meant to stifle black men's manhood. The idea of anyone who, and I think that's directly connected to oftentimes the genitals were mutilated. Besides, of course, the connection to it being of sex. And the reality is that some of the times, and not even all, right, this, she mentions multiple lynchings just evolved into having nothing to do with sex and women at all. But that when you had the few cases where it actually was involved with sex, it wasn't rape, it was just based on sex. And so that how dare there be any connection to manhood in that. If you look at what the caricatures of segregated South were, right? There's either two, and that's connected to it as well. She doesn't argue that specifically. She just talks about the manhood, but it's very much connected to those two caricatures that you have, and it's the same justification for rape for women. For women, they're either the motherly, non-sexual older women who are domestic servants, or they're overly sexualized women. So that's used to justify that the rape of women, of black women. Or for men, they're if they're not the older, simpleton that is harmless, then they're super dangerous, ultra sexualized men who are a danger to society. And those are your only two options for that. And one, for the characterization of over-sexualization on women, justifies rape and sexual abuse of women with those caricatures, and very much does. And then for men, that over-sexualization of men as super dangerous sex fiends justifies the lynchings and physical violence against men. But ultimately, all of this was used to reinforce power and control and reinforce white control over the black population. And that if there was anyone who stepped out of those bounds and those norms of segregation, of the social hierarchy, then the threat and terror of lynching was there to remind people where their place in society was. And that was only reinforced by the fact that people were not held accountable. No one was charged during this period in the 1800s to the early 1900s with murder. No one was charged for murder, for mob lynchings. I mean, to the point, obviously, they took pictures, they publicized it, they passed it around. It wouldn't have been hard to identify some of them, even with the lack of modern day forensic technology that they had. You had pictures of it with people writing their names on it. So there's no like, oh, who knows who these people are? We don't even have identification yet at this point. It was there in the photographs, if nothing else, and everyone knew in the neighborhood who participated and who did that. But there was no consequence. I mean, and it turned violent against the cops. There were police, there were some police who were complicit and allowed them to do this, like with this story with the grocer, where they opened it up and allowed the men to pick out the grocers so they could go lynch them. Other police tried to prevent mobs from breaking into the jail. And they were threatened with lynching. So again, what didn't take much to transfer the violence of lynching from black people to white people, if they tried to stand up against it, if they fought for black rights, you were a potential victim as well, because you were disrupting the order of things and not doing what you were supposed to do. So you were a disgrace to your race for protecting, for defending. And there were a couple of cases of police stations that were overrun, and they literally destroyed the jail. Like it was a small town jail, like not a large scale jail or large scale prison, right? This was just a small town prison and police station, but they overran it, beat up the police officers who refused to leave and kicked them out and said, if you don't go now, we're going to lynch you too. I think they probably just said, you're going to kill you too, but we're going to kill you too with them. And then tore down the whole place and took the men out. So there was that, and then there were those that were very willing participants and complicit in the whole thing. But if you stood up to, right, like with the wife of the man who was lynched, who then protested and complained, she was lynched. Supporters were lynched. It was that mob fury, and again, people willingly, openly doing so, and that open violence was a day-to-day thing of the segregated South, not just in lynchings, but also in beatings and attacks, which weren't meant to kill someone, but were just meant to physically remind them, and that was a constant, and it was intentional, because you needed that fear and that violence to reinforce that control and that structure in society. So that's where we're going to end with the segregated South. Again, this goes until the 1960s. Lynching continues. It does begin to slow down around the 1920s, but it doesn't stop. So it's not like it's over in the 1920s. What you do have is the number of lynchings decreases in the 1920s. You actually have the reemergence of the KKK, in part because of activists like Ida B. Wells, who spread the message of what lynching was, the horrors of it, the reasons for it, tries to dismantle the propaganda, and you have more and more activists in these women's groups that actively start promoting protests against this, and so it becomes more visible, right? It was very visible in the South, and it was known in the North, but it was not as visible. So in other areas where lynchings weren't as common, because of activists like Ida B. Wells and her women's groups, this became more visible and known, and people started demanding some change. Nonetheless, it did not end lynching completely. And the segregated South, the systems of separate but equal, lasted until the 1960s. But the Jim Crow is still around today. Those caricatures, and actually just within recent events, has been in discussion. The example I've always used in the past is Aunt Jemima. The syrup is the pancake syrup is still around. That they just announced that they were going to change that. But that's not the only one. You can find examples, not just in antique stores. You can find examples of these caricatures in, I think there was one recently of a doll in the dollar store that was being sold, or the Dollar Tree, one of the dollar store type of things. You find it in games, you find it in little figurines, in pictures. It's still in cartoons. In the 1950s, there were still lots of cartoons that were even used in the North that had incorporated those caricatures into their cartoons. So it seeped into the North in a variety of ways, even if it wasn't as prevalent in everyday items, but they were still there. You could still get those. And these items that were manufactured to reinforce segregation in the South were sold throughout the U.S. So it wasn't just a Southern thing, the Jim Crow caricatures and items. But still to this day, although, like I said, several were brought up and discussed about changing, that's not all of them, and you can still look at see that in there. I might do an extra credit with that, because I think that would be I think it's a valuable thing to recognize, because a lot of people hear this and they think, oh well, that's no longer a thing, and you're like, well, no, there's still the legacy of what those Jim Crow caricatures did, to not only reinforce racism and superiority of white control, by putting it in such a massive influx of everyday objects, is that it did normalize it, and so much so that, like, there's plenty of people who didn't take a second thought about Aunt Jemima syrup and think, why is that still being used? How is that okay, right? Because it got so normalized as a product that no one was like, this is from the Jim Crow caricatures of black women, and fits all of those characteristics. You know, how is that still something being sold today? So I'm probably going to put up an extra credit thing of identifying Jim Crow era caricatures that are still found in today's things. I'll have to think about what I'm going to specifically, how to write up this assignment, but look for that. I'll try to put that up in the next couple days. Next lecture, we are moving on to the progressive era. So we've been in the South, we are moving back to the North, And around the same time frame, well, the segregated South goes all the way to the 1960s, but looking at the 1880s to the early 1900s is the progressive era period. And women were super involved in this period in the North, with settlement houses, with political reform, and pretty much women's rights movement, and pretty much every aspect of the progressive era. Women were there in the forefront and behind the scenes, pushing for change, and in a way that was far more involved and far more prevalent than really we've seen up to this point. You've had women activists, yes, we have women pushing for women's rights, but it was this massive uptick of women being involved, and in part that's going to have to do with the increase in women graduating with college degrees and looking to get into the job market, looking to get into political and social reform. All right, so that's what we'll talk about next time.